It was supernatural. Perhaps feeling sorry for him, another officer agreed to stay up with Spate the following night. The young lieutenant was hoping to catch another glimpse of his ghostly friend. But this time, things would take a far more chilling turn. Much to the surprise of both Spate and the officer standing watch with him, Edward would return the following night. The two stunned men watched as his ghost simply walked into the dugout, stopped at one place, and then slowly extended his arm to point at the dirt floor. Then, he once again vanished into thin air. After the men had composed themselves, both of them in a state of shock after watching a man disappear in front of them, Lieutenant Spate stood up. He immediately called a few other soldiers over with their trench shovels and told them to start digging in the spot where the ghost of Edward had just pointed to. Ignoring the sheer strangeness of the whole situation, Spate just couldn't shake the thought that Edward was trying to tell him something very important. There was a reason he had been pointing to that spot on the ground. As they dug deeper, he realized what that was. After digging down about 3 feet into the floor of the dugout, the men uncovered something shocking. The Germans, it seemed, had been tunneling their way beneath the British lines and planting large amounts of explosives right under their feet. To their horror, the explosives appeared to be fully wired and could be detonated remotely, possibly at any second. The alarm was raised immediately, and the section of trench was quickly evacuated. The explosives were then disarmed and removed without incident. Everyone wanted to credit Lieutenant Spate for discovering the explosives and saving the lives of the men, but Spate knew differently. In spite of all his reason and logic, his military training and experience as a leader, all of which told him to think rationally and not give in to superstition and hysteria, Lieutenant Spate never doubted once that the ghost of his friend Edward was the one who had saved them.
Oh, Eddie. Save the day from something.
What do you think, sir?
We will stick to the usual path, Sergeant. I don't think Command wants us wandering too far on these patrols.
Yes, sir. Understood.
From here.
What was that, Sergeant?
Sir?
Didn't you say something just now?
Oh, no. No, sir.
Must have been the wind. All right, let's get the men moving.
Said not from here.
Sergeant, perhaps it is best if we do not move from here.
But, sir, if we go back that way...
Tell the men to move back.
While the Great War played host to many cases of what some would consider divine intervention, this phenomenon is by no means unique to European battlefields or Western militaries. Wars have been indiscriminately fought across the globe, in every country and region of the world, and it would seem that protecting spirits do not discriminate between one war and the next. This next account was written by an Indian man named Hrishikesh and was shared online in a forum discussing wartime paranormal experiences. In it, he tells two stories. One of his grandfather, a former soldier in the Indian Army's Maratha Light Infantry Regiment, and another from his grandmother, both set during India's border scuffles with China during the early 1960s. He writes,
I heard this from my grandfather on my mother's side. He served in the Indian Army's Maratha Light Infantry Regiment and fought in the Indo-Pakistan War of 1965 and 1971, as well as the Indochina War of 1962. These two instances happened in 1962. He was leading a platoon for a recce patrol. They were somewhere in northeast India, where they were to meet a returning patrol party who had been long overdue. There were Chinese hidden in the dense forest waiting to ambush the unsuspecting patrols. There was a shorter route that went through not-so-dense forest with good visibility, and then a longer route with dense forest that was rarely used. Oblivious to the Chinese trap the platoon led by my grandpa
Oh
took the
no.
usual route. Suddenly, he felt a tap on his shoulder, and a commanding voice whispered, "Not from here." He just ignored it and marched forward. This time it was even stronger, and the command boomed in his ears, "I said, not from here." He stopped in his tracks and was reconsidering what to do when the Chinese saw that they were not falling for the ambush and started firing on them. Immediately, the returning patrol also joined them in a retaliatory fire, and the Chinese fled, being outnumbered. The other platoon commander reported there were unconfirmed reports of an ambush, but they could not come back on time as their only jeep had failed on the way. Their radio had also failed, so they set off on foot to reach the base. Them fending off the ambush saved not only his platoon, but also helped in defending that sector of land for quite some time.
Mayday! Mayday! This is Packet 1. Chinese have taken the post. I say again, Chinese have taken the post. We are going down.
The second half of Hrishikesh's post details another account from his grandfather's service during the Indochina border war, this time told from the perspective of his grandmother. After being saved by the direct intervention of supernatural forces, Hrishikesh's grandfather would find himself aiding with supply drops to the army's most remote outposts, scattered around the vast northern mountains. During one of these flights, he would be shot down over enemy territory. When they received the news, his family believed that he had died in the crash. However, Hrishikesh's grandmother knew something they didn't. While everyone around her started to mourn the loss of her husband, she said that something, or someone, was telling her that he was still alive.
While dropping food and supplies on the Indochina border post, my grandpa was in a small plane called the Packet. They had been flying low to facilitate the drop. The Chinese had captured the post and were waiting for the supplies to arrive. They had not removed the Indian flag from the post, so no one knew that the post had been captured. After they dropped their cargo, the Chinese began firing on the plane and hit the rudder. The plane lost control and crashed in some dense forest below. The pilot managed to report that they had been hit, but searches of the area yielded no result. Assuming that the plane fell over the Chinese side and all 4 occupants were dead, they sent my grandpa's belongings back home. My granny was in shock. When family and neighbors gathered, they all started the rituals of cracking her bangles and removing the vermilion on her forehead. She stubbornly stopped them and said that, "I'm not a widow yet. He will come back." And after a couple of days, the unit sent a telegram saying he had indeed been found and was safe. My granny said that she heard the voice of her deceased mother saying, "You are not widowed yet. Don't allow them to treat you as one."
Yeah. You're not the widow yet.
This next story takes place thousands of miles away and nearly 40 years later, but it bears an uncanny resemblance to the events described by Hrishikesh's family. This account, shared online by a man named Roland Bartetsko, describes a similar instance in which someone unseen evidently saved the life of his friend. The story finds us in the 1999 Kosovo War, a regional conflict that saw the Serbian forces of Yugoslavia clash with the ethnically Albanian Kosovo Liberation Army. While the war was small in scale, it was defined by its brutality and ethnic violence, prompting NATO forces to intervene with a bombing campaign against Yugoslavia. As Roland's friend, a young woman named Spresa, fled her hometown in Kosovo alongside other refugees, he describes the events that followed.
When the war had come to her small village in the north of Kosovo. She and her family packed a few belongings and left their home. She had become a refugee, like more than half of the population. Everybody wanted to get out of the country as quickly as possible. Her family's neighbor had a tractor and invited her family to put their bags, their small children, and the elderly on the tractor's trailer. At the time, my friend was 18, and therefore she had to walk alongside the tractor. They soon met more refugees and formed a long column. In the late afternoon, she suddenly heard a voice shouting her name, Shpresa, get down. And again, Shpresa, get down. She let herself fall to the ground. At this moment, a Serbian machine gun started opening fire on the refugee convoy. She heard the bullets zipping over her head and hitting the tractor and trailer. There were screams everywhere. Around her, people were dying. After only a few seconds, the machine gun fire had ebbed down. The few survivors got up and started looking for their loved ones. Every person that had been sitting on the tractor or the trailer was badly injured or dead. My friend was the only survivor of her family. It was the voice that had come out of nowhere that had saved her life. She was never completely sure who had been shouting her name and told her to get down. But she told me that at the critical moment, she thought that it was her grandfather who had called her. She had always loved her grandfather and felt very close to him. However, the old man had died 2 years before the outbreak of the war.
Well, thanks, Grandpa.
I just don't understand how anyone can believe in these kinds of things. Miracles, divine intervention. Doesn't make sense. People put all this faith in things that can't be logically proven. It's just blind belief.
But that's where you're wrong, Mijo. You say miracles can't be proven. But sometimes the proof isn't written in a textbook. Hebrews 11 tells us that Abraham had faith in God's promise to give him a son. He didn't just believe blindly. His wife was 90, and he was 100 when Isaac was born. He saw with his own eyes what God had promised to do, and from that, it says that he reasoned that God could do anything.
Reason? You're saying this Abraham guy reasoned, but what do you mean by that? His reasoning was that he believed in something that was completely outside of logic. And what proof do we have that Abraham even existed? Sounds like a fairy tale to me.
What is it that makes you trust the men whose books you read?
That's easy. The difference is that these men, these philosophers, these scientists, they base their ideas on evidence. They don't ask you to blindly accept things that can't be proven. They use logic, reason, and observation to make conclusions. Their theories are tested, challenged, and refined over time. You can't just accept something because someone says it's true.
So, you believe these men are wise and truthful because even if one textbook had more than, say, 40 different authors, their wisdom remains consistent. And you can see that wisdom is true, no matter who is teaching it.
Exactly. These men aren't asking for blind trust. They provide frameworks that can be questioned, debated, and refined. They put their ideas to the test through experiment, through logic. And we, the students, are encouraged to challenge them.
Even the disciples asked questions when they did not understand something. Tell me, Francis, Do you think anyone could simply pick up your textbook and understand the wisdom it contains by reading it?
Well, no, of course not. It's taken me years to study it. And I asked my professors loads of questions, took exams, wrote reports. But, Maria, even you could understand it if you just took the time to read it and study with teachers like I have.
That is very true, mijo. Wisdom is something God calls treasure. Proverbs says that it is something that you have to earnestly search for, like silver. You have found one kind of wisdom, but even your reasoning and logic must tell you that there are different kinds. But there is only one that gives life.
Huh. Well, Maria, I may not agree with you on everything, but you sure know how to carry a conversation.
This final account was written by a Vietnam veteran by the name of Francis E. Kazimek, not long after his tour of duty in the early 1970s. Despite being what he considers a man of logic and reason, he has no explanation to offer for a vivid dream he had while deployed. A dream that he believes was a message from a departed friend. A dream that offered him both comfort and assurance during such a brutal conflict, and one that he says he owes his life to. He titled his story, My Friend, Maria. I attended the University of the Americas in Mexico City during the 1967 to 68 school year. I was a junior, majoring in philosophy. Logic and dialectic were the tools with which I proved and examined all statements and beliefs. I believed man's power, indeed his very humanity, revolved around his ability to reason. Accordingly, I scorned anything that smacked of the irrational, including religious experiences of extraordinary nature, psychic phenomena, and out-of-body experiences. During the Christmas vacation of 1967, some friends and I rented a villa in the seaside town of Playa Azul. This Pacific Ocean town is approximately 200 miles north of Acapulco. Our live-in maid and cook was a woman named Maria Sanchez, a charming, although quiet and serious woman of about 55 years. Because of a severe sunburn, I spent most of the vacation relaxing in the villa, and I got to know Maria rather well. Although she had little formal schooling, she possessed a quick wit and keen sense of observation. Our long talks ranged freely from topic to topic. She was deeply religious and told me many stories of miracles and visions. I dismissed these tales as local folklore. She firmly maintained that she herself had seen visions. I laughed and told her she had an overactive imagination. After I returned to the United States, I occasionally wrote Maria a short letter or postcard. She answered regularly with long, carefully written letters. Then in 1970, I was drafted into the Army and sent to Vietnam. My faith in reason was shattered by the hell I found there. This is what rational men do, I asked myself. In September 1970, I was wounded and sent to the regimental hospital. I was in a state of deep depression and knew that I would never survive my tour of duty. I was certain I would be killed or crippled, or that I would freak out. One night, I had the most vivid dream of my life. In the dream, I was sitting on the beach in my uniform with my rifle by my side. Maria sat by me silently and brushed the top of my head with her hand. Her cool, soothing palm on my forehead filled me with a wonderful peace. I woke the next morning feeling calm and somehow confident that everything would turn out for the best. I immediately sat down and wrote Maria a letter. I later returned to duty, strangely purged of my depression. A few months later, in late December, I received a letter from Maria's daughter, Graciela Moises. She apologized for not having written sooner. She said that her mother had been very fond of me and had often spoken about me. Her mother, she told me, had died in September. which would have been around the same time that I had that very vivid dream. I am certain that our friendship somehow transcended those barriers of time and space in a manner that cannot be explained logically or rationally. I still think about Maria often because she is the reason I survived.
That's kind of, isn't it?
Hey guys, thanks for sticking around for the after action here in the credits. These stories I found to be both a mix of some cabinets and drawers were locked, so they probably missed a handful of water. There were several times where I really needed water. I didn't have any water. There shouldn't have been any water nearby, but through a strange series of circumstances, I was able to get water. We never seemed to not have what we needed when we needed it. If you like these stories, make sure that you are keeping up with the Wartime Stories podcasts side of things, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. We do have exclusive episodes coming out on. Been looking at the podcast at all, you've probably missed a handful of them so far, but we've got another one coming out soon, those to catch up on. But here is a snippet from one of the upcoming episodes. Check it out. A few minutes later, Bob and the inside crew made their way through the front door of the FBI building. He usually resorted to some funny remark when he was feeling nervous, but tonight he couldn't utter a word. He and the others silently climbed the stairwell, then squeezed through the hallway office door, carrying 2 bulky suitcases. Once inside, they split up to search the rooms. Some cabinets and drawers were locked, so they used screwdrivers to pry them open. Bob used a taped-over flashlight to provide minimal light, being careful not to let the beam show from the windows. He occasionally checked the street outside to make sure no police were around. Working mainly in the dark, they took every piece of paper they could find, except for some blank personnel forms. It was time to get out, but they couldn't just leave. The group had decided it was best not to have cars parked nearby drawing attention, so they needed to call the getaway drivers who were back at the motel. One of the team members picked up a phone from a desk and dialed the number. When Keith heard the shrill ring, he picked up the receiver. All he heard was a cryptic, "Okay." Then the line went dead. That was the signal Keith had been waiting for. He glanced over at the other getaway driver, and they both sprang into action, hurrying to their cars. They drove towards the FBI office, ready to execute the next phase of the plan. A few minutes later, Keith breathed a sigh of relief as he watched his friends emerge from the FBI building. Their overstuffed suitcases bounced side to side as they ran towards Keith's car and the other getaway vehicle. He waited anxiously as they loaded the suitcases into the trunk of the cars. Now that they were out in the open, he couldn't help but feel nervous. Keith surveyed the deserted neighborhood. There was a courthouse across the street that always had a guard posted. That's when he nearly let out a gasp. The guard was looking right at them as they loaded up the vehicles. Keith turned to see how the rest of the group was progressing with the baggage. He silently willed them to move more quickly. As soon as the group finished packing up the car, Keith drove off, heading to their safe house out in the country. On the way, he told everyone that a guard had seen them. The only thing they could do now was hope that he wouldn't report them. If you like what you heard, make sure you go check it out. It's called Redacted Declassified Mysteries with me, Luke LaManna. You can catch it on Spotify.
Over the last few decades, an isolated rural community in the northwestern United States has been the site of a series of disturbing and inexplicable incidents. The inhabitants have reported encounters with a mysterious race of creatures who appear without warning, leaving little trace in their wake. This week on Bedtime Stories, we take a trip to April Falls. It had already turned to night time as the hunter had made his way back through the forests toward the settlement. He cursed his luck, having again pursued a deer far further than he'd initially intended, ultimately failing to capture it. Now he was returning home empty-handed, and at risk of losing his way as he travelled back through the murky darkness. Mentally bracing himself for the inevitable criticism and mockery of the rest of his family, he didn't even see the strange light off in the distance at first. It was only when it started to move around at speed that he finally noticed it, out of the corner of his eye. Coming to a halt, he had watched on in wonder as it hurtled around through the woods. The light was floating a few feet above the ground, zigzagging from side to side in a quick and haphazard fashion. He had never seen anything like it, and was still staring in wonder when he realized it was coming directly towards where he was standing. Moments later, the foliage ahead of him exploded, as the mysterious phenomenon finally entered the clearing. There was a brief pause, and then suddenly an ear-piercing shriek. The hunter found himself now fully bathed in the light's brightness, unable to see or focus on anything effectively. As the high-pitched scream that accompanied the light became too much to bear, he cried out in fear, turning around and running as quickly as he could for his home and safety. Mysterious lights and high-pitched screaming are only a small portion of the incidents experienced by the inhabitants of April Falls. Others have reported seeing small figures concealing themselves within the tree line, following their movements. There are also accounts of terrifying creatures that travel along the nearby waterways or in the skies above, emitting terrifying cries and unnatural beams of light. One father had taken his son out hunting down by the lake when they became aware of just such a monster. It had been sat off in the distance in the middle of the vast body of water when it had seemingly caught sight of the pair. Emitting a deep rumbling noise, it had then started to head towards them at high speed, emitting piercing shrieks, causing the pair to flee back to the safety of the trees. Another resident of the township had been walking along in the woods at the onset of dusk when she'd heard a strange noise in the skies overhead. Looking up, she had seen a giant ball of light hovering up above the tree canopy. This bizarre entity had begun to descend closer to the ground, seeming to search for her by projecting its light down through the trees. Thankfully, she was able to find refuge in a nearby cave, only emerging again with the safety of daylight. But it is the stories of the little people that live in the woods around April Falls that prove the most unnerving of all. Descriptions given by the residents who have encountered them differ, with the exact height and colour of the creatures seeming to vary somewhat. But all of the witnesses agree that these strange entities are incredibly fast and incredibly hostile. Two teenagers out playing on their own one afternoon claimed to have heard rustling in some nearby trees before three little people emerged out into the open. These childlike entities began to gabble at each other and wave their arms around, clearly excited at seeing the teens. One of them produced a strange device which started to flash at varying intervals. As the young residents turned to flee, there were a series of loud bangs, and they claimed that the trees around them began to shiver and shake. When they later returned with an adult, there was no trace that the encounter had ever taken place. Other witnesses have related similar attacks by these dwarf-like entities. Some have described what appear to be spears of varying length that can project heat and flame. In addition to this, strange metal snares and traps have been found, sometimes with the bodies of unfortunate wildlife decaying within them. To date, all of these encounters have taken place deep in the lush and verdant forests that surround the community and not near the town itself. This has led some commentators to believe that the sightings are little more than the work of overactive imaginations and a result of fireside tales passed down from older generations. Those who do not believe in these bald squatches, as the creatures have become known, point to the fact that none have ever been captured, and the weakness of the physical evidence attributed to them. Strange footprints, seemingly devoid of toes, have been dismissed as the work of pranksters. Clumps of hair and fur found near the scene of some of the incidents have also been attributed to moose and bison. And yet, even without hard evidence of their existence, it is hard to disbelieve the reports that have been made. Those who have come forward to share their stories have nothing to gain from doing so, other than ridicule and abuse. They are adamant that there is a race of little people going about their lives, hidden away, deep in the woods. Inevitably, as the community of April Falls continues to expand and grow, it will find itself travelling deeper and further into the land that surrounds it, and as it does so, it's possible that some of the questions surrounding the existence of these bald squatches may finally be answered.
Throughout the world, there are numerous examples of highways and thoroughfares which are believed to be haunted by the spirits of previous travellers. Perhaps one of the most gruesome and well-publicised examples of this phenomenon is to be found on an unassuming stretch of road which cuts through one of England's most beautiful national parks. This week, we investigate the horrifying legend of the Hairy Hands of Dartmoor. As he sat and listened to the coroner's opening statement, the young constable had tried to cast his mind back to the case in question. Several months had passed now since the accident had taken place, and he was struggling to distinguish the facts of this particular incident from the many others he had attended since it had transpired. He was painfully aware of the attention his uniform was receiving from the other interested parties seated around him in court. In addition to the families of the victims, several members of the local authority were also in attendance, as well as a significant number of journalists. Cursing his poor luck at having been the officer who attended the scene, he found himself once again nervously wiping his palms down the sides of his trousers. The coroner continued to read through the statements of the various witnesses who he had not felt the need to call to the inquest. The ambulance workers who had attended the scene, the doctor who had performed the autopsy on the male party, the nursing staff who had treated his female companion, who had survived. Their written accounts were all relayed in a calm and composed manner, the facts agreed and deemed protected from any scrutiny. Finally, the coroner laid down the sheaf of papers he had been reading from and asked for the constable by name. The officer rose before swearing the oath on a Bible which had been handed to him by the clerk, and then introduced himself to the court. He was then led through his statement by the coroner, who would pause on occasion to clarify something, or to ask him to expand on a particular point. The constable related how he had been called to attend a stretch of highway known as the B3212, which was located near Cherrybrook Bridge. There had been a traffic accident involving a motorcycle and sidecar, the occupants of which had been severely injured. He explained how the male rider had been rushed to the hospital in Tavistock and had died of serious head injuries, but that the same doctors had managed to save his girlfriend, who had been thrown clear of the impact. He was asked to clarify that no other vehicles had been involved, and that there was no suggestion of alcohol having played a part in proceedings. From witnesses at the scene, it appeared as though the rider had lost control, despite travelling in a straight line, with nothing in his path which might have caused him to swerve. The twisted remains of his motorbike had later been examined by a local mechanic, with no defects identified. His testimony complete, the coroner asked if any of the other assembled parties had any further questions for the officer. There was a pause, and then a hand was raised by one of the reporters. Is the constable familiar with the story of the hairy hands, and was there any indication that this local legend had some bearing on the fatal crash? There was a longer pause, as the young constable carefully considered his answer, aware that all eyes in the courtroom were now fixed upon him. Eventually he replied that he could not identify any apparent reason for the crash, and that the true cause had most likely been lost now, along with the life of the rider. Having been dismissed, he made straight for the court doors, avoiding the gaze of all those present. He was in fact very familiar with the tales of the spectral hands that haunted the road between Pottsbridge and Two Bridges, but he had not been completely sure what the wounded motorist had been mumbling, as he had been placed in the rear of the ambulance at the scene. And he was damned if he was going to condemn his entire career to ridicule by admitting to the reporter that the dying man may indeed have been claiming an invisible person had wrenched control of the motorbike from him. The first suggestions that some malevolent entity was at work on the B3212 can be traced back to the turn of the century. In the early 1900s, several cyclists who had been travelling along this particular stretch of road claimed that an invisible force had physically taken hold of their handlebars. Having gained control of the steering, it had then caused them to swerve sharply and fall from their bikes, sustaining serious injuries in some cases. Naturally, the local constabulary took a dim view of these explanations, but as time progressed, such reports stubbornly persisted. Into the mid-1910s, a number of pony and traps were forced off the same road, with the drivers again claiming that they had felt a pair of rough and hairy hands overlay their own, before yanking the reins they were holding to one side. There followed several crashes involving motor vehicles, with one traveller being found dead in the driver's seat of his car, which had overturned as it had come off the main carriageway. It was during the summer of 1921 that the legend of Dartmoor's hairy-handed ghost finally became cemented in the national consciousness, following a pair of terrifying incidents which took place on the road. The first of these occurred in June of that year, and involved Dr. E.H. Helby, who was the medical officer at the nearby Dartmoor prison. Helby had agreed to take the daughters of the prison's governor out for a ride in his motorcycle combination. The two young girls seated in his sidecar had screamed and cheered in delight as the bike had powered along the road, until suddenly, the doctor began to struggle to retain control. He had fought unsuccessfully for a few seconds to straighten the handlebars, before the motorbike hurtled off the carriageway and into a ditch. The doctor was killed by the force of the impact, but both girls survived. When they were interviewed by the police in the following days, they claimed that immediately prior to the crash, Helby had yelled at them to jump, telling them that someone had grabbed hold of his hands and was trying to crash the motorbike. Neither had seen anybody else present, but were adamant that their driver had been visibly struggling with someone or something. The following August, the local police were called to another accident involving a motorcycle, this time ridden by a young army captain. On this occasion, the rider had survived his ordeal, and swore blind to the officers that he had felt the sensation of a pair of large and rough hands closing over his own, which had then wrenched his handlebars violently to one side. Several years later, in 1924, a woman and her husband who were holidaying in the vicinity of Powder Mills claimed to have had an encounter with the haunted hands. The female party stated that she had been awoken in the night by the sound of something scratching against the outside of the caravan they were camping in. Rising from her bed, she had followed the noise as it had travelled away from the door frame across the exterior of the caravan to one of the windows. Suddenly, a large male hand had appeared on the pane of glass. The woman had watched in terror as it had made its way up across the window, trying to get inside at the top where it was slightly ajar. She screamed out in alarm and then reflexively made the sign of the cross. As her bewildered husband had awoken and sprung out of the bed, the hand had promptly disappeared, leaving no trace that it had been there. Almost 4 decades would pass before another such incident was reported to the police, when a terrified motorist by the name of Florence Warwick staggered into a local police station. In floods of tears, she reported how she had pulled over to the side of the road to check her map, as she had gotten lost whilst visiting family in the area. Warwick related how she had switched off her engine, and then produced a small torch from her handbag to inspect the route. Suddenly, she was startled by a dull thump on the windscreen, and had turned the torch upwards to see what had caused the sound. Recoiling in horror, she saw 2 large and hairy disembodied hands pressed flat against the glass of the window. Once the officers had managed to sufficiently calm the distressed motorist, they drove her back to the scene and searched the lay-by where she had stopped, but they did not find anything of consequence. Having satisfied themselves that she was neither intoxicated nor suffering from some form of mental episode, and not knowing what else they could do, they escorted her to the campsite where she was staying, advising her to get a good night's rest. There remains a great deal of speculation as to who the owner of the spectral hands may be. Some historians and local residents claim that they could originate from a motorist who died in a horrific crash on the road, losing both his hands in the process. Others state that they belong to the spirit of a prisoner who was executed at Dartmoor Prison, and seeks vengeance on the souls of the living from beyond the grave. The majority of commentators, though, are drawn to the tale of an unnamed worker at the nearby Powder Mills. In this story, the man was able to quit his job at the gunpowder factory, as he was left an inheritance from a wealthy aunt who had passed away. Having enjoyed a lengthy period of celebration at a local hostelry, the worker then decided that he wanted to reclaim his personal tools from his former employer. Staggering into the factory, the drunken man forgot that he was wearing his own hobnail shoes, rather than the safety boots he had been issued with by the company's owners. A spark caused by his footwear, which was making contact with the granite floor, subsequently ignited some of the nearby powder, and immediately caused a huge explosion. Once the fires had been brought under control, all that was found of the victim were his hands, lying severed on the cold stony floor. Documentary evidence revealed in local newspapers certainly suggests that prior to its closure, the gunpowder factory was no stranger to misfortune. Serious accidents were reported there in both 1851 and 1857, which resulted in the deaths of workers due to explosion or fire, though neither make specific reference to the discovery of dismembered appendages. Who knows? Perhaps the hands are not even human at all. Sitting alongside these news stories is an alternative theory regarding the high number of traffic accidents which have occurred on the road, put forward by a writer named Beatrice Chase. In her article, she alleges that the moorland which the carriageway had been carved through contained a significant quantity of metal deposits, which exerted a magnetic effect on the motor vehicles that were travelling across it. There is no evidence that the local authorities have given any credence to Chase's theory, or investigated it to any significant degree. Official police reports of accidents which have occurred on the B3212 make reference to drivers being tired or intoxicated and unfamiliar with the roads they are driving upon. Work has also been carried out to reduce the camber of the carriageway in some parts, as it was considered to have contributed to the collisions. There are striking similarities between this story from the wilds of Dartmoor and other haunted highways around the world. We have already examined the case of the ghostly hitchhiker, who is believed to have antagonized passing motorists in the vicinity of Uniondale in South Africa. Another such example is the woman in white, who leaves the seats of motorists who offer her a lift, soaked through with water from the nearby lake, in which she drowned. Dartmoor's hairy hands are by no means the only example of a pair of disembodied and ghostly appendages which have been separated from their owner. In the Mexican city of San Luis Potosi, 2 sets of severed hands are said to haunt an alleyway in the Alfalfa district. These are thought to belong to 2 boys, who were executed in 1780 for the murder of a priest. Closer to home, there has been widespread speculation that a photograph taken in Northern Ireland during the early 1900s may have captured a ghostly severed hand. The image, which shows 15 female workers posing at a linen factory, appears to depict a hand resting on the shoulder of one of the women, even though they all had their arms folded at the time the image was captured. Unfortunately, over time, the legend of the hairy hands has become something of a go-to for motorists who have been involved in traffic collisions throughout the region. In many of these cases, more obvious and viable explanations have been evidenced and documented by investigators, which has only served to undermine and devalue the stories featuring the hairy hands from the county's distant past. We may never know if there is any truth behind this haunting legend from the southwest of England, or if it is simply a fabrication created and perpetually revisited by motorists in order to excuse poor standards of driving. Regardless, if you do happen to find yourself driving through the rolling moors and heathlands of Dartmoor, think twice before taking the B3212. The Underground has been at the centre of London's transport infrastructure for almost a century and a half. During that time, it has played host to many historical events, from sheltering civilians in the Second World War to being a target of the 2005 London terrorist attacks. Many people have lost their lives in these tunnels. Could their souls remain as ghosts of the London Underground? But first, don't forget to pick up an amazing deal from this episode's sponsor, Surfshark. You can't do better than Surfshark in terms of bang for your buck. You get all the features of a premium VPN for the insanely low price of just $60 for 27 months worth of service. That's just $2.20 a month. On top of that, you can buy with complete confidence, thanks to the 30-day money-back guarantee. One of the things I love about Surfshark is that you can use it on unlimited devices. Many other VPN providers limit the amount of devices you can protect, but with Surfshark, it's $20 a month. Work had been fairly relaxed for Steve Coates. His shift had started at 10 p.m, and besides the inevitable rush of commuters in the last stretch before the tube station closed, the early hours of this midweek morning had been quiet. As the supervisor of Liverpool Street Station in central London, he now busied himself in the ticket office, cashing up the tills and carrying out any number of other mundane administrative tasks. Steve much preferred the relative peace and quiet of the night shifts compared to the hustle and bustle of the daytime, even if they did seem to pass by more slowly. There was a strange sense of priviness in having such a large public space all to himself, a tranquility he otherwise rarely got to experience. On the desk in front of him, the phone began to ring, shattering the silence. Picking up the receiver, the familiar voice of the line controller, who was stationed off-site, told Steve that he was looking at the CCTV feed from the eastbound platform of Liverpool Street, and that he could see a man down there, standing near to the tunnel entrance. The station supervisor checked his watch. It was just after 2 a.m. The gates to the station had been closed and padlocked almost 3 hours beforehand, so there shouldn't have been anyone besides him inside the station itself. He told the line controller that he would go down and check, and then hung up. Taking the escalator down to the platform in question, Steve did a thorough sweep of the area. As he reached the eastbound tunnel entrance, he took out his torch and shone it along the tracks receding into the pitch dark of the subway. He also checked the line immediately below the platform as he made his way back, but there was no one there. The platform itself was completely empty. At the bottom of the escalators there was a public phone, which Steve used to call the line controller back and tell him that he had carried out a thorough search and that the platform was secure. But the line controller's response didn't make any sense.
I can see you on the monitor right now. I can see the tunnel entrance. He's standing right there. He's wearing white overalls.
Confused, Steve agreed to take another look, leaving the phone hanging with the controller on the other end of the line. He went off and performed another search, but still the platform was completely empty. "There's no one else here," he said to his colleague when he got back to the phone, but the line controller was having none of it.
How did you not see him? He was standing right next to you. He's wearing white overalls. You shone your torch right at him for several seconds. There's no way you couldn't have seen him.
"Either you're winding me up, or there is a glitch on your screen," Steve replied. "I've done 2 sweeps now, and I'm telling you, there is no one else here." With that, he put the phone down and turned to go back up the escalators, when something made him stop in his tracks. On the bench opposite, he saw a set of white overalls draped over the seat and armrest, which were definitely not there before. A sudden chill went up his spine as he quickened his pace and made his way back up to the ticket office. He wasn't to know it at the time, but he had just had a run-in with the famous Liverpool Street Ghost. Opened in 1890, the London Underground is the oldest subway system in the world. Each year, 1.3 billion people pass through its 270 stations, which are collectively manned by nearly 6,000 members of staff. Most of the passengers who take the subway do so without a second thought, completely oblivious to the history which surrounds them. The ground in which this system is built has been settled upon for millennia. From the Underground's initial inception right up to the present day, there have been thousands of accidental deaths, suicides and tragic events, not to mention the amount of graveyards, cemeteries, plague pits and church crypts which have been disrupted or relocated during its construction. Add all of these things together, and the number of potentially disturbed souls begins to soar. For the average commuter, the day-to-day experience of riding the tube is one of overcrowded chaos, especially in the headache-inducing rush hour. But if they were able to visit any one of the many stations during the midnight hours, long after closing, they would discover an entirely different world. One which is mostly peaceful, but can also be unnerving, haunting, and downright eerie. What follows is just some of the stories told by those who work on the London Underground. In the summer of 1992, the supervisor of Beacon Tree Station, Tariq Rana, was working a late shift after closing down for the night. He was just finishing off some final paperwork and then planned to head home. On the right side of the office in which he was sitting, there was a door which led up to the overground district line platform. In the relative silence, this door began to rattle, but Tariq thought nothing of it. Rattling doors were a frequent occurrence, due to the updrafts and downdrafts created by passing trains. He simply assumed that a train was approaching on the district line. A few minutes later, when the door rattled a second time, he was sure he would soon hear the rumble of carriages passing above and to the right of him, but that sound never materialized. Confused, he made his way through the door and up onto the district line platform to see what was going on. But looking up and down the tracks, he could see that no trains were approaching from either the left or right. Even though he could feel no breeze on the night air, he reasoned that the rattling must have been caused by the wind and headed back down to the office to finish up. But no sooner had he closed the door behind him when it rattled a third time. Now, however, it was much more sustained. Unnerved by this bizarre occurrence, he decided to head up to the station foyer, where another member of staff was working. As he stepped out onto the disused subway platform and began to make his way up the steps, he suddenly experienced an intense feeling that someone was standing behind him. Turning his head, he saw the terrifying image of a woman a few steps further down from where he was. She had long blonde hair, but no face. It was completely blank where her features should have been. Utterly shaken, Tariq turned and ran up to the station foyer, taking 3 steps at a time. When they met, his colleague remarked how he looked as if he had seen a ghost, and when Tariq replied saying, "I think I just have," his co-worker's response was, "Did you see the blonde woman with no face?" Apparently in 1958, there was a train collision at this station on the district line, which killed 10 people, and Tariq was not the only person to have seen the blonde lady of Beacon Tree. 12 miles west of Beacon Tree, you will find the station at Hyde Park Corner, one of the most central stops on the network. Back in November of 1978, Barry Oakley was working the night shift, long after the last train had left. He and a colleague had shut the escalators down by removing the corresponding circuit breakers in the control room. They had then returned to the supervisor's office to continue their administrative tasks. At around 2:30 in the morning, they heard an almighty commotion outside, which sounded like grinding gears mixed with a rhythmic knocking. Running out to the foyer, they were surprised to see that one of the escalators they had previously shut down was now running again, but making a hell of a racket in the process. This came as a complete shock to the two men, because as far as they were aware, once the circuit breakers had been removed, it was impossible for the escalators to run, as there was no power going to them. Not only that, but it would require a special key to start back up again. After a brief investigation, in which they found that the circuit breaker was still removed, they managed to shut the escalator down once more, and then return to the office. Barry would later say that during this whole time, He had a strong sense that someone else was there in the station with them, besides himself and his colleague. After settling back into his paperwork, he happened to glance across to his co-worker and saw that he was now standing with his back flat against the office wall, pale-faced and clearly in some sort of trance. Barry's initial thought was that the man was having a seizure, as he was completely unresponsive. After several minutes, he came back to his senses, and with a haunted look, he said, "Did you see the face?" Apparently, as the two of them had been sitting there working away, a hideous face had appeared at the office window and stared at both of them. His colleague went home shortly afterwards and never returned to that particular station.
Oh, it didn't go down?
Perhaps one of the most unenviable jobs in the London Underground is known as track walking.
Oh, that poor wolf.
Track walkers are
wandering
required to
around
patrol
with
the
a bullet
tunnels
in
at night,
ass.
long after the trains have stopped, usually moving from one station to another. They do this alone and completely in the dark, with only a battery-powered torch to light their way. During the early 2000s, Bill McCown was a veteran track walker, having been in the job for more than 20 years. On one particular occasion, he was walking the Jubilee line between the stations of Finchley and Charing Cross, a distance of about 8 miles. He decided to take a quick break on a stretch of track which ran between Baker Street and St John's Wood. He had been sitting down for about 2 minutes when he heard a strange sound off to his right. Shining his torch in that direction, he couldn't see anything, but then he suddenly noticed that the ballast between the tracks was moving.
I seen you lurking.
As the commotion moved closer to him, he could hear footsteps walking
Seen you
past.
lurking. I didn't want to call you out or nothing.
He could see the ballast sinking down with each step. Dumbfounded
Hopefully
by
you
what
have
he was
a good day and you have
Bill
a good...
later reported that he felt a tingling sensation, like static, all through his body as it drew level with him. It carried on past him for about 10 meters, and then stopped. Sitting in complete silence once more, Bill now contemplated that he had to carry on walking in that same direction in order to finish his patrol, which he did with no small amount of trepidation. Upon reaching Charing Cross Station, his supervisor remarked on how pale he looked, and when Bill responded saying, "You're not going to believe what's just happened," his supervisor quickly cut him off and said, "Don't tell me you've seen footprints in the ballast." Bill was not the first person to have witnessed the phenomenon, and he wouldn't be the last. Records show that a track walker suffered a fatal heart attack whilst patrolling that same stretch of the Jubilee line many years before. Kennington is allegedly one of the most haunted stations on the network, with more unexplained phenomena being reported there than anywhere else, thanks to a section of track known as Kennington Loop. The loop exists to allow southbound trains to turn around and head north again. Passengers are cleared out at Kennington Station before the empty trains are sent into the loop, where they will often have to wait for up to 20 minutes in the 150-year-old tunnels. And whilst they are waiting, there is no way anyone can get on or off the train. Bob Cairn and Larry DeLarabiti both worked on the Northern Line. Bob was a driver and Larry was a guard. Larry describes how many years ago he was working on a train that had been sent into the loop. There had been an incident further up the line, which meant that he and his driver were stuck there for about 10 minutes. Sitting in the rearmost carriage, he heard the unmistakable sound further up the train of the interconnecting doors between each car opening. It was getting closer and closer, until finally the doors to his carriage opened, and he turned expecting to see his driver, but there was nobody there. Similarly, Bob also heard the sound of the doors opening at the front end of the train, and he turned expecting to see his colleague, but was greeted by dead air. The twist in this tale is that Bob and Larry were on different trains. Their experiences took place 4 years apart from each other, and the two men have never met. The story goes that a passenger had been killed at Kennington 50 years beforehand, whilst trying to board the train between carriages. His body was dragged into the loop. It seems the London Underground is utterly steeped in stories of the unexplained. Almost every station appears to exhibit some form of strange phenomena, or has its own resident ghost, sometimes several. There is so much more to tell, from the accounts regarding the nun of Bank Monument Station, to the phantom maintenance man of South Island Place, from the crying children of Bethnal Green, to the demonic presence which stalks a disused tunnel at Embankment. Not to mention the strange activity often witnessed at the 15 abandoned stations still attached to the network. This is most definitely a subject we would like to revisit in the near future, but in the meantime, is there any explanation for what people are experiencing? Unfortunately, very little exists in the way of proof. Over the years, some interesting images have been captured, but like so many pictures of so-called ghosts, they are inconclusive. What we are left with is mostly anecdotal accounts. A study carried out by Coventry University within the last decade has uncovered high levels of infrasound in many of the alleged hotspots. But whilst this might account for feelings of unease or auditory anomalies, it would rarely, if ever, result in hallucinations of full-bodied apparitions. Whatever the case may be, whether people really are seeing the spirits of those who have tragically lost their lives in these tunnels, or are simply repeating well-established ghost stories for their 15 minutes of fame, it is probably best to approach the London Underground with an open mind. More often than not, it is the people who expect to see something who witness nothing at all, and those who expect to see nothing who end up having a life-changing experience.
Spooky. Namaste, man. Good morning. How are you?
Did somebody say waffles?
No.
I have brain damage.
It's okay to have brain. That or both. Let's Badger. Integrally pressed. Like it. Gonna grab my headphone. Quiet. Okay. Sometimes slow, sometimes it's loud. It's weird that way. Oh, you watch it. Watch it on mobile? Yeah, mobile's that way. Not much you can really do about it. Kinda around it. Let's see. We got him right in the ass, right? Going past the corner. Not that it really. Don't know that those will fit. Oh, they will. Plenty of extra RAM. Not that I really. Vroom, vroom, vroom. Beep, beep. Beep, 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 beep. Beep, beep.
I have come here to chew bubblegum and kick ass. And I'm all out of bubblegum.
Thank you for the follow. Oh, shit. Don't read chat and follows and stuff while you're driving down a bumpy road. Get wiped out. Thank you for the follow. I appreciate it. Welcome to the Salt Shaker. Hopefully everyone's doing well this morning. This fine Friday morning. Hungry. The end of my stream day. Had a very light meal beforehand. A little on the hungry side. Morning. Zombies in the road. Look out. Oh, they didn't look out. Got run over. Oh, that was close. See that? Tried kamikaze. Bastard. Nine hours game time, and we're almost back to exactly where we started when we got on. Very long round trip. Bounty. Here we go. Remember, want to swap out vet. BoredomHub, while very cool vest. Uh, Straight out for that one. Camo, 150. Or this one, 100 slots takes. Tactical pouches, gun slots. Shirt. Slots for not, and got it back. Close to half. But that shirt, $500,000. Might have to grind to be able to get that shirt. Now you could swap out vests for 250,000. I'd give rifles slot for pouches. Like carrier pouches. Or the belt, 50 slots, and has slots for all pairs and plate carrier. Yeah. A lot more grinding if you wanna get the rest of that. You have to a lot more. In order to get all that. And let me call it a day because been on 10 hours. Long day. Long day of driving and looting Cherno. Friday morning on a quick raid out to everybody. Stick around for the raid. Oh, silence. Doing what? Part 2. Enjoy her. A lot of fun to teach. I will be back on just like normal. Hopefully you guys will be able to come hang out some more. We do scary, weird stories in the background while you watch me run around acting like. In the meantime, enjoy your Friday. Enjoy the start to your weekend. Partake responsibly. Well, enjoy yourself. Then I'll be back tonight. Don't know what time, but I will always check Discord or watching for posts. time, play silence. Remember, at the end of the day, game. Have fun with it. Good night, everybody. Bye.